Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2019 J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Annual Lecture of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Tonight's lecture is called At the Margin of the Holocaust, Writing the Biography of a Mischling in the German Foreign Office. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm the director of the museum's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. Let me begin this evening with a thank you to the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Charitable Trust. The Shapiro Trust enables the Mandel Center to bring a distinguished scholar to the museum each year to conduct research and to disseminate their work to the public. The scholar in residence also leads seminars, lectures at universities in the United States, and serves in general as a resource for the museum, for educators, for students, and for the general public. Tonight's speaker is our 2019-2020 Shapiro Fellow, Jean-Marc Dreyfus. He is a leading expert in the history of the Holocaust, particularly in France. Professor Dreyfus is a reader at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He's also associate researcher at the Center of History at Sciences Po in Paris. Professor Dreyfus is a specialist of the economic and diplomatic aspects of the Holocaust and of post-war reparations. He's done extensive research on the history of looted art and in the unfinished restitution process. And this research has resulted in publications of many books and articles in French and English, in media appearances, and even in participation in government commissions studying reparations. He's the author of 6 monographs, including, and I'm going to give this title in English rather than in French, including one entitled The Impossible Reparation, Deportees, Looted Property, Nazi Gold, and War Criminals. That book was published in 2015 in Paris. His latest publication was done in collaboration with Professor Alexandra Garbarini, who's with us here tonight. This was an edition of a very special Holocaust diary by a man named Lucien Dreyfus that came out in French in 2018, and I'm proud to say that an English translation of this diary is forthcoming from the Mandel Center's series in 2020. Professor Dreyfus is now at work on a project on the history of corpses. To this end, he co-organized the ERC research program entitled Corpses of Mass Violence and Genocide. As the Shapiro Senior Scholar here this year, he's writing a monograph on the French mission in search of deportees' corpses after they had been deported and the Holocaust from 1946 to 1960. So I'm about to call up Professor Dreyfus, but I want to let you know what will happen after. So after his presentation, we will have a question and answer session, but we're going to do this in a special way. Rather than asking you to raise your hands, we're going to ask you to write on those cards that were distributed at the beginning, and we can hand out some more. Museum staff will come up and down the aisles, and you can pass them to them, and they'll bring them to me up here, and then I can ask them of Professor Dreyfus directly up here in conversation. After the Q&A, I would love to invite all of you upstairs to a reception in the Hall of Witness. Before we begin, I want to thank all the wonderful staff who made tonight's program possible. And I'd also like to ask all of you to turn off your cell phones. And now join me in welcoming Dr. Dreyfus to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to stand here tonight in front of you as a Senior Shapiro Fellow in the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. I must say that the life of a Holocaust historian is very often nomadic. And as a sailor, I'm glad to say that one of my ports is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I come again and again to work, meet, and exchange. I want to thank the museum, this great institution, my colleagues, friends from the Mandel Center, for giving me this opportunity, 6 months of research in the widest, most comprehensive Holocaust documentation center, archive, with the best librarians and archivists, wonderful colleagues, and a wonderful team of co-fellows. I want to thank especially Professor Lisa Leff, Betsy, Anthony, Sam, Suzanne Born-Fleming, particularly for organizing this event. And I'm very glad to see many familiar faces of friends, colleagues, and even family. And it's also a possibility, I must confess that I'm a bit moved tonight to present for the first time, really for the first time, this long and rather complicated research I have made. It is tonight the first time that I present this research. A research that I have to come to consider as finished, even if it is, and something I will argue, still open-ended. It's a manuscript in French that I reviewed and reviewed many versions, and finally will be published in October 2020 in Paris by Vendémiaire. It's a nice revolutionary name. We like revolution in France. So Vendémiaire Publishing House, great. I'd gladly taken the manuscript and I'm about to send in the coming days the final version. So the book is a biography, which sounds quite banal. It's a classic. But in fact, and for several reasons I will try to develop, I call it more a family biography. So it's one individual and more marginally his family. The individual is this gentleman, Baron Vollrath von Maltzan, Freiherr von Maltzan, and his closest relatives. In this sense, the framing of the research questions, dealt with the question of the turn to the microhistory of the Holocaust. It's something we are discussing widely in the circles of Holocaust studies. And the microhistory of the Holocaust is something I will also try to argue, is not only a question of scales. It's not that you magnify one individual and it will suddenly give you some more insights into a difficult question in Holocaust studies. It goes beyond this question of scale. So I decided to write this biography. Decided to face the turn to a history of the Holocaust. But also, I wanted to, like so many of my colleagues do, try to face the intimate experience of one person, one Jew, in this case, a Mischling, half Jew, one victim. Can we call him half a victim? Some of this microhistory of the Holocaust also faced same question, but for perpetrators. And at some point I wondered if Vollrath von Maltzan was not also a bit of a perpetrator, but I will elaborate on this. So you pick up an anonymous victim, an anonymous Jew, and then you want to write extensively his or her story throughout the Holocaust. But this is different, because Vollrath von Maltzan was not an anonymous, any victim of half victim. He was an ambassador. And I didn't put it in the title, but he was, and that's what attracted originally my interest in this character, he was the first West German ambassador appointed to Paris after World War II. So in 1955, in March 1955, the West German government, with another change in the occupation regime, got the permission to appoint an ambassador. So that was him, important in the history, the post-war history of Germany. But he's not a major character either. He's not a famous character. I'm sure that you have not heard of him before reading the invitation to this talk. So he's neither the anonymous, he's not François-Joseph Pinagot, the famous book by Alain Corbin, who decided to write the story of someone that is totally unknown, an anonymous French person, and to see what kind of traces this person left in 19th century France, famous book. But he's neither a famous major character. He's middle rank, in between. Why did I start this research? So the first reason I can give you is I found a good story, as the journalists would say, a good story. Yes, you have this Mischling, half-Jewish diplomat going through Weimar, National Socialism, occupation regime, West Germany, till 1958, when he retired, early retirement. And I found it in a footnote of our book that many of you know, Das Amt und die Vergangenheit, the book on the history of the Foreign Office, Auswärtiges Amt, in Germany. That's just a very brief footnote, and I was attracted by this footnote about what happened to this Vollrath von Maltzan. And I didn't start, and this is very important, I didn't start this research because I found interesting documents. So very often we will decide to write the history of this person because we found letters, a diary, an unpublished memoir. And then we will turn to the microhistory of the Holocaust. That's not the way. I hope I made the good decision. You tell me. It had caused for me soul searching, many reflection, much rewriting. I started in 2012. researching this history. Von Maltzan, it's a name that is not unknown in Germany. It's a known, not very well known aristocratic family. It's known because there are many Maltzan, hundreds of thousands of members of the family. But it's not a family that reached the top of the power. They are not the Bülows. Oh, they are related to the Bülows. They come from Mecklenburg, and you had, through centuries and centuries, intermarriage with the Bülow and other more famous aristocratic family. The family dates back to the 12th century in Mecklenburg. That's the father, who was named also Vollrath von Maltzan, same name. And the mother, and I will tell you about the strange case of the mother. The mother was born Hermine Rosenfeld, and she came from a family originally from Frankfurt, but she was born in Berlin, and she came from a family of Jewish bankers. So her father, the grandfather of Vollrath, was the banker Rosenfeld, had a bank in Berlin. And she was related to many other family of Jewish bankers. So we have this strange biography, two streams of German history merging. The Jewish banks, so important in the modernization, in Jewish history of Germany, and this very old aristocratic family, and that's what he inherited of. The Maltzan still exists. They have a family association, Familienverein, that was created in 1878. In itself, it's interesting why family members decided to unite to create this association. It still exists. Reason? Officially, it was for self-help, to help the impoverished members of the family. It's to write the history, so they commissioned, at the end of the 19th century, books on all the members of the family trees, description of all the Freiherren, the barons of Maltzan, and also very explicitly, that's something they make explicit today, it's for the memory. It's right, the memory of the family. Okay, I show you this photo again, but you have the photo in full. And I want to show you the signature of the photograph. And I don't know if you can read, it's written Harcourt, Paris. And this photo, it's a photo I encountered several times in my research. So I went to different places, different archives, different family archives, and I was shown the same photo 5 times. A photo that looks very official, but it's not. The Studio Harcourt in Paris was very famous in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and it was famous because famous people, artists, politicians, aristocrats, were going to Harcourt and were paying to have their photo taken. So in itself, it's an interesting document. Cosette Harcourt was in fact Jewish. Her studio was Aryanized in 1940. But the studio continued to take photos, to function throughout the occupation. I don't have the date of the photo. I don't know when the photo was taken. Was it in the 1930s when Vollrath von Maltzan was posted at the German embassy in Paris? Was it during the war? Maybe he traveled to Paris for his functions, or was it after the war? The photo is taken, so it's photographed like a movie star, with big projector, with, limelight, with sharp contrast, So I wonder why did he want his photo to be taken by Harcourt? The photo was given to me, a copy of the photo was given to me by the Family Association. I want to thank them, Bernd von Maltzan, the president. And it was published in the publications, self-publication made by this association. So they are very proud of Vollrath von Maltzan. And then I came across the photo in official file, personal document of him in the Foreign Office. So I came into contact with the Family Association, so Bernd von Maltzan in Bad Homburg, and he has in his basement, so it's private, very private family archives, and he gave me access to the archives of Vollrath von Maltzan. So I contacted him, he said, you should visit me, I have things to show you. So I was very excited. I expected to find a treasure trove of personal document. And in fact, what did I find? A few official documents, very official documents, the medals, a big box full of the medals that, are traditional in the life of a diplomat, including the Légion d'honneur, la Grande Croix, so the highest rank of the French Légion d'honneur, the French medal. It's in the box. So, a few official documents, medals, and family photos. A lot of family photos. But no personal document. No letters, no diary, no... So I had a lot of material, but it's not the material we are used to write microhistory of the Holocaust. There was one personal document I found in my research. It was a card sent by Vollrath von Maltzan to his cousin Bunny, that was the nickname given, Sobenheim, who had survived the Holocaust in emigrating to London. So the London branch of the family, Sobenheim, so the Jewish side of the family, gave me. So it's a card, and it's a birthday card for the 50th birthday of Bunny Sobenheim. They were first cousin. It's very banal. What can you take, from 3 sentences on a card? Dear Bunny, my best wishes for your birthday. I have the best memories of our childhood. So I could deduct that they were close in their childhood. Maybe I can count as a personal document too. Second one, I can count an interview that Vollrath von Maltzan gave to a Brazilian newspaper in May 1951. And in itself, it's an interesting chapter of his life story. It was probably the first big official diplomatic mission of the West German Republic. For the first time, Bonn was allowed by the Allies to send an official mission to a foreign country. It was to negotiate a trade agreement between West Germany and the newly created Federal Republic and Brazil. And that was the main task of Vollrath von Maltzan, who was specialist of economic diplomacy. Trade agreement. He spent his life negotiating trade agreements. He could go, but with the specific conditions stated by the Allies, and particularly by André François Poncet, who was the French High Commissioner in Germany, that he should not be named an ambassador, could be a Gesandter, an envoy, special envoy, but not an ambassador. So he arrived, he got the reception like a head of state, and he gave an interview to the Jornal do Brasil, in which he told a bit, very briefly, his story in World War II. So he said, my sister was being arrested and sent to a camp. My mother died of exhaustion before being transferred to Theresienstadt. And he said, I was saved by the all-powerful IG Farben. That's what he said to the journalist. IG Farben, you remember, is the trust with all the German chemical industry, and that has been tried, and we know the responsibility IG Farben had in Auschwitz. One of the main factory of IG Farben was IG Auschwitz. That was the name. It was Monowitz, the third camp of the Auschwitz complex. He says, they saved me because they registered me as a part of their necessary workforce. So I could not be deported. I could stay in my office in Berlin. It saved me from being sent to a labor camp for half-Jews. But he didn't say half-Jews. The word Jew is not pronounced in these interviews. It's very fascinating. He spoke also to the journalist, and he's very unique because he gave quite a few interviews in his function as an ambassador to the press, to the French press. It's the only time he mentioned his personal story. And he said, I grew up in the Reichsland, so in Alsace. At that time it was German, before 1918. And he confirmed, stressed his duty, the duty he felt to serve his country, Germany. So it was dedication to the German nation. Very strange. In 1951. Why this confession? The only one he publicly made. First time, the only time he publicly spoke very briefly about what happened to him in the Holocaust. Was it a moment of weakness? Suddenly the ambassador, very strict, very kept, very severe, would have a moment of, he will tell his personal history. Was it a strategy used in searching his own legitimation as an wannabe ambassador when the diplomacy of West Germany, of the Federal Republic, was only starting? Bonn was eager to develop a diplomacy, but could not in 1951. I don't know. And there are many things, after those years of research, I don't know. So the photos I found in Bad Homburg in this, the basement of this nice villa of Bernd von Maltzan, these personal documents that are not so personal. And you have a photo, or you recognize our ambassador, Vollrath von Maltzan, his wife, with the fur coat, and Sergei Vinogradov, who was at that time the Soviet ambassador to Paris, and the wife of Vinogradov. And you have the card of Vinogradov. That was a photo that was made official because one of the first tasks Vollrath von Maltzan had to perform when he was appointed to Paris, when he arrived, was to prepare the now famous trip of Adenauer, the German Chancellor, to Moscow. And because there was no diplomatic relation between West Germany and the Soviet Union at that time, the diplomatic channel went through Paris. It was an important trip. We know that Adenauer officially asked for the return of the last German prisoners of war. That was granted to him. So many families who were waiting for the return of their son, father, husband, they knew that there was no hope. So the last one returned to West Germany. A few of them were immediately convicted for war crimes. That's the irony of the story. And we know that when they came back, so Vollrath von Maltzan, Adenauer, the German delegation, when they came back, they landed, you had a famous scene of German women in black, going them and kneeling in front of the Chancellor to thank him, to beg for the return of the sons. And I have a photo of this moment in the personal archives. So what I can see is that Vollrath von Maltzan was the man of kind of discrete missions. And very often I could feel, reading the archives of the Foreign Office, I could feel that there was something here that I don't have all the documentation. For example, Israel's role in the relation with the State of Israel. At that time, Vollrath von Maltzan was very close to Ludwig Erhard, considered as the father of the economic miracle, and he was not his deputy, but he was in the first circle around Erhard. So to summarize the story of diplomat, it's in the title of my presentation. Grew up in Alsace, in Odratzheim, in a small chateau. Studied during World War I for a year at the University of Strasbourg. Then he continued studying in Germany, spent a few months in the front, was a young diplomat, and he got some help within the German Foreign Office at that time, thanks to his uncle, Ago von Maltzan. And Ago von Maltzan was the all-powerful, very visible diplomat at that time. He was the German ambassador to Washington. Oh, uncle, that's very strange. So you find some notes in the archives of the Foreign Office. My dear uncle, my dear nephew. Uncle, nephew, family tree, I could not find it. In fact, explanation in aristocratic family, people call themselves uncle, aunt, cousin, even though they are very, very remote. So in fact, Ago von Maltzan and Vollrath von Maltzan had great-grandfather who were first cousin. But because they bore the same names, they consider, so they were calling themselves nephew and uncle. It's very difficult because you have to know in a family gathering exactly where you sit in the family tree. So he got this support, and then he worked briefly with Stresemann the moment Germany entered the League of Nations. He was a man of Stresemann. After Locarno, trying to bring back Germany after World War I and the defeat into a balance of power, negotiation, diplomatic negotiation in Europe. This brief moment of where, there was hope that peace and cooperation could be developed in the interwar period. Then he was posted in Warsaw. I know it because of the CV and because I found one photo. And then he was posted in Paris, and then it was January 1933, and you know probably, April 1933, the law for the restoration of the civil service, and the Jews were to be expelled from the civil service. So he had to fill up the form, bring the various certificate, and he was labeled as a Mischling, half Jew. In fact, the word Mischling entered German law only after the Nuremberg law, the decrees following the Nuremberg law, and his career was blocked. He was not fired immediately because he was a Frontkämpfer, so he had been a soldier for Germany first line, and because he was only half Jewish, and because he had some inside protection. But he could not be promoted, and he could not be posted abroad. He had to stay in Berlin. He was finally fired in October 1938, and it's very strange, just after having been promoted to the rank of Legationsrat, advisor, from the rank of Legationssekretär. So promotion, and immediately, 3 weeks later, signed by Hitler, and the certificates, the two certificates are in these personal archives, fired. Then he went to work immediately for IG Farben. He had a pay rise, he made more money working for IG Farben. He was in the economy department, Volkswirtschaft, so he was writing reports, very generic reports on the economy of Germany, of Europe, etc., war economy. And then, and that's a surprise, in summer 1939, he was called again to the Foreign Office, but as a policy officer, so he was external contractor, no permanent position. This goes with what we read about the fate of Mischling in the Reich, that the professional ban for them was relaxed a bit at the beginning of the war, because so many German men being drafted, one needed the workforce. Not for the Jews, of course, but for the half-Jews. That there was a moment where, the Mischling had it a bit easier. What happened to Vollrath von Maltzan? And that the surprise, after the fall of France, he was appointed in Wiesbaden in the commission following the treaty, French-German Treaty of June 1940. He was called in this commission where the collaboration, economic collaboration between France and Germany was negotiated. And the commission sat in Wiesbaden, which was ironic because Wiesbaden was the town of the family, of his family, after 1919, when they have been expelled from Alsace. He was living with his mother. The mother, Hermine, was living in Wiesbaden. It lasted for 3 months, and then Hemmen, who was heading the German delegation, decided that he didn't want a Mischling in his team. So he was fired, but he stayed in Berlin in the Foreign Office. What did he do? He negotiated trade agreement. That was his big specialty. Which trade agreement did he negotiate in 1940? There was one negotiated with the Soviet Union following the pact, Ribbentrop-Molotov of 1939, and one with Denmark. And he was traveling. It's quite extraordinary for a Mischling. I wonder if in his office of the Foreign Office, German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if he has seen a copy of the protocol of the Wannsee Conference, because we know that the protocol circulated, not widely, but circulated a bit within the Foreign Office. And we know that about half of the text is about Mischling and Jews in mixed marriage. May 1942 was expelled again, went to IG Farben again, and what did he do? Writing reports. He had an office on Unter den Linden, the main avenue of Berlin. July 1945, he re-established himself in what was called the economic administration of the British zone of occupation. And it was, to make a long story short, this administration of economy was a German administration from which the economic ministry of the Federal Republic emerged. It came close to Ludwig Erhard. And when the Federal Ministry of Economy was created in Bonn in May 1949, Vollrath became one of the 9 directors of this ministry, and in charge, of course, of trade, commercial relation. So I went to Weißensee, so the main Jewish cemetery in Berlin. So this is one of the many beautiful monuments. I don't know if you've been. It's an extraordinary place to understand the history of German Jews. But the grave I looked for was not as grand as the one I show you. That's this one. In the archives of the Berlin Jewish community, there is the documentation of the Jewish hospital. And in the Book of Dead, that is being kept, I could read that the mother, Hermine Rosenfeld, who was converted and a widow, so she was not protected by her statute, she had died in the hospital on the 20th of April 1945. The 20th of April 1945. So she was not deported. She died. She was very old. She died probably in the cellar, the basement of the hospital, because we know that it was the moment of the attack, the Soviet attack to Berlin, and then we know, according to the testimonies of few survivors, everybody was, in shelter on the ground. And then she was buried on the 10th of May 1945 in the Jewish cemetery, probably the first Jewish funeral to take place in Weißensee after the collapse of the Reich. I'm watching the time. And then you have, it's very well kept and sorted, and you have Feld, Gebiet, Rang, and the number of the grave, and I looked for the grave, and that's what I found. Very strange. It's not marked. I could not determine the number because of the grave just on both sides, So I wonder, is the corpse of Hermine von Maltzan, born of Rosenfeld, still in the cemetery? So there is a mystery about the mother, Hermine Rosenfeld. Was she not deported to the East? She had no protection. She was a widow. Her husband had died in 1924 in Wiesbaden. She had married the father of Vollrath von Maltzan, converted to Protestantism, and lived the life of an aristocrat, quite impoverished after 1918. In that sense, this intermarriage between German Jews, mostly women, and aristocrats is an interesting chapter of German Jewish history. We not elaborate, there are some works, but just to remind you an anecdote, in 1910, when the main association of German aristocrats decided to implement the anti-Jewish clause very early, which means to expel from its ranks the Jewish members, they expelled 4% of the members. So you see that this intermarriage between German Jews, wealthy families, and aristocrats was not uncommon. The sister of Hermine, Lili, married Kurt Sobernheim, who was a very important Jewish banker because he has been for 30 years the president of the Commerzbank, so one of the three main German banks. And he retired in 1932. Kurt Sobernheim and his wife Lili went in exile to Paris as early as May 1933. So it's very early. They felt threatened. Again, I don't know why. I could not figure out why so early. In a golden exile, they went to live on Avenue Foch, so one of the most prestigious avenues in Paris. And then I find that Kurt Sobernheim died at the end of June 1940 in the hands of the Gestapo. One of the first French victims of the Gestapo. And his wife died in a Paris hospital on the 12th of July 1940, so very early. Hermine Rosenberg lived in Wiesbaden, in the Taunusstraße, with one of her daughters. She was arrested by the Gestapo on the 17th of December 1942 because the file of the Gestapo of Wiesbaden still exists. Not the document, just the file. I don't have just the file with dates. I have nothing more than the file. The daughter, Eleonore, was sent to prison in Frankfurt, where she stayed for a few months, and then she was expelled to Berlin. The mother was also expelled from Wiesbaden to Berlin, and Hermine Rosenfeld found a shelter in the Jewish hospital. As you may know, the only Jewish institution to survive throughout the Holocaust till 1945, without being dismantled. I found twice this photo, once in London, once in Wiesbaden, and you have the 6 cousins. And on the back of the photo, you have the name, and you see you have the Sobernheim and the Maltzan. It's very precise. Don't mix the Sobernheim with the Maltzan. And you have Bunny, Jochen, nicknamed Jockel, Grete, Vollrath, who was nicknamed Voigt, Ehrengard, Gardi, and Eleanor, who was living with her mother and spent some months in jail, was Dolly. Something like an anecdote in old aristocratic family is that they like to give, in the family, kind of ridiculous nickname. So they're very conscious of their, status, but in the intimacy of the family, they give nicknames. Marcel Proust has written elaborately hundreds of pages about the ridiculous nicknames given in the high aristocracy. So, the cousin, happiness. We are in Alsace before 1914. I have had a lot of such photos showing group, children, happy games, in a long summer in the chateau of Odratzheim. Bunny survived in exile in London, had one daughter. Jochen survived as a Mischling. Grete was a cousin, Sobenheim, you see the S, was deported in the first convoy from Berlin to the east, to the Lodz ghetto in October 1941. And I know nothing about her but that she died on the 9th of March 1942, and that on her card, the death certificate, written by the functionaries of the Judenrat, she was a worker. So I can only deduct that she had to work in order to make a living in the ghetto. And it was the first time in her life. She had never worked before. She was from a privileged family. So I was confronted to this material. So I give you a few pages of the album. The album is recent. I don't know who made it. And I have those kind of photo, group, family, Alsace, and nothing else. So what can I deduct? So how can we historians read those documents? So for example, if you look at the photo on the right side, the lowest photo, you see a woman in black. And I don't know who she is. So I wonder, but it's only a guess, if she was not the mademoiselle, the French instructor that was common in aristocratic family. When Vollrath von Maltzan gave his first interview to Le Monde, the daily French newspaper, the journalist said that Vollrath remarkably well. His French was remarkable. He spoke French remarkably well. So I wonder if he has not learned his French from this mademoiselle that was living with the family to teach him French. But I don't know. So we have the personal, not so personal document, but we have also the very official document, Personalakten, personal document of his career in the Foreign Office. 3 big boxes, it's very well kept, very detailed. And this is the famous Fragebogen, the questionnaire that Vollrath von Maltzan had to fill up. In fact, in 1946, as part of the denazification process he went through. And that was a surprise to me. He was half Jewish. Why did he have to go through this process of denazification. So it's a famous questionnaire with dozens of questions, over 100 questions about what the person has done during the war. And as you can see, is asked about his membership to the various Nazi organizations. I know many of you are familiar with this kind of material. And of course it's empty. You see, because he was half Jewish, so he could not enter this Nazi organization. So we have only two lines. The Labor Front, DAF, was a member, and the Red Cross was a member of the Red Cross in 1942 and 1943. So this is also the paradox of his status. He had to go through the denazification process, but he also could claim compensation. And most of the material I could use was the material of Wiedergutmachung, compensation, scattered, in Munich, in Berlin, in Wiesbaden. I found also in the personal document this very simple postcard. So it's sent by Ernst Kutscher, and Ernst Kutscher was a diplomat. And it's greeting, congratulation notes to Vollrath von Maltzan when he was appointed to Paris. And you see the date, February 1955, the announcement that he was to be sent to Paris. But Kutscher is known to Holocaust scholars. He's known because there is one document of Nuremberg about him. He has worked in the Wilhelmstrasse, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in the document of Nuremberg PS 3339 that you find, I have the signature in the Foreign Office. It's the protocol of a meeting of the propaganda department of the Foreign Office, and Ernst Kutscher is quoted saying, European Jews are responsible for the wars. They force the people to go to war because it is their interest. Jews are other people's misfortune. A victory of the Jews would mean the end of all culture. For example, in the Soviet Union, when Germany fights Jews, she does not do it for Germany only, but to protect the whole of European culture, etc., etc. A very long quote attributed to Kutscher, and he was talking to 12 diplomats posted abroad, and it was on the 4th of April 1944. So it's an interesting, mix, especially at the time when, 5 million Jews of Europe were already dead. Kutscher, a few months later, maybe thanks to this card, was sent from Tehran, where he was posted, to Paris. And he arrived as not the number 2, but number 3 of the embassy, which provoked war and protest from the Association of Survivors, Resistance Fighters, and Jews, because the document of Nuremberg was known. And Vollrath stood in favor of Kutscher. But that was a big affair, very common in the history of post-war Foreign Office, that many scandals emerged. Then I came back to Wiesbaden. I say I did a bit of the research in Wiesbaden because in Wiesbaden, it's the capital city of Essen. It's where you have the main archives of Essen. And I looked for the Holocaust Memorial. And this is an interesting piece. It's where the synagogue stood till November 1939, and it's a wall, and you see that you have the names of the victims. And of course, I looked for the name of Hermine von Maltzan Rosenberg, and I did not find her on the name of the victim. Does it mean that the history of this family was the margins of the Holocaust? In Paris, Vollrath von Maltzan had to deal with quite a few re-emergence of the past. He was the one who had to deal with the German protest to the Cannes Film Festival when the film Night and Fog was shown officially. He had to face the Kutcher scandal and some others that I will not develop here. Come back to the photo. The archives of the studio have been kept. So I asked the archivist, could you tell me when this photo was taken? And the answer I got is the photo was taken in 1958. No months. I have no. So in 1958, Vollrath von Maltzan was the ambassador, the very well-received ambassador. He did a lot to start the French-German reconciliation that led to the Friendship Treaty of January 1963, the Élysée Treaty. And I don't know why he decided to have his photo taken. His last action as the ambassador, before being called back to Bonn, was to have a lunch with de Gaulle at the Noailles and François Sédou, who was his counterpart, the French ambassador to Bonn. It was very famous, it took place in the country house of de Gaulle in October 1958. Conclusion. In this presentation, I gave you some fragments of my research, but only some meager conclusion. As I said in beginning the presentation, the research is open-ended. It is open-ended as should be, every research in history. But it is especially open-ended because of the missing information. I could not describe the life and destiny of Vollrath von Maltzan. I could approach him only from far. In that sense, this research has been an exercise in humility. Even with all the skills we have learned, even with the extraordinary advance in finding, reading, interpreting documents of the Holocaust. And this museum is not the least important place for this exercise, and we have advanced a lot. Even with this, I have to accept that the main part of the image, the painting, the puzzle, should remain in the dark. That is, there is more I do not know than I know. I could only fugitively approach Vollrath von Maltzan. One of the few readers of the manuscript asked me, "Did you finally learn to love him?" So I was taken aback by the question. This remark was not only ironic. It asked for an answer about the necessary positioning the historian has to take facing his subject. I wrote in the manuscript soon to be published that in fact I have no real interest in Vollrath von Maltzan. I don't find him very interesting. I'm not interested in his personality, in his severe and strict temperament. Surely, I do not identify consciously or unconsciously with him. That I'm not longing I missed encounter with him. He died before I was born. I started with this research being more interested in what Vollrath von Maltzan, as a Mischling in the Foreign Office, represented, had to tell me about the Holocaust, about his own positioning, more than being interested in his life story per se. After presenting a few of the few pieces I have collected on this fascinating life story, I think I have changed my mind about him and about my imagined relation with him. Yes, he's interesting. I thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Jean-Marc. And thank you, audience, for writing your potential questions on cards and then passing them to the aisle so they can be collected by our staff. Maybe while that's happening, I'll get to ask my own questions. So I'm really intrigued by your sort of microhistorical approach, and I want to push you to talk more about this method because, you know, in the end, you're talking about a certain frustration with all of the holes that wind up in your story. But of course, those holes are the result of your own choices, right? You've chosen someone about whom the record is so small. If you want to know about Mischling, you could, if you had looked at a really wide sample, you would have gotten answers to questions about this category. If you had looked at all of the work of the German Foreign Office in Western Europe or in France, you would have gotten those answers. There are ways to get those answers. Why use microhistory to get at questions? What does this add to our understanding that make it worth it to put up with the holes?
This is the most difficult question I have to face. I would say that microhistory will tell you, you change the scale and you see more. That's basically what we teach our students. And I say I change the scale and I see not more, I see something very different. This story that he could stay in the Foreign Office till May 1942 was very unexpected. I didn't expect that he was called back to the Foreign Office. So I would say that it questions the current trend in microhistory of the Holocaust. But it's not only that. It's also, you could probably feel it, when I was frustrated, in looking at him only and not finding what I wanted, or what I expected. I widened the scope. This is a temptation. You don't write on him, then you will write on all the Mischling. And of course, I read all possible writing on the Mischling, and I read all the books on the Foreign Office, etc. But that's a temptation I faced, and I tried to resist. Think, okay, you have to face the fact that you have only pieces of the puzzle.
I'm struck by your comment in your conclusion about humility, and one of the things that sticking to your method of just looking at this one story, it forces you into that certain humility that as soon as you take the wider scope, you give that up, right? Because then you say, well, it doesn't matter about this guy because I know about 900 other Mischling, and so I can guess based on it. And you don't allow yourself that here.
Yeah, in fact,
right?
I even wrote, and then I got rid of the pages.
Yeah.
I mean, I was, okay, I don't know about him himself. In fact, I know a bit more than I told you, I know why he could stay in the Foreign Office, and found out thanks to the Wiedergutmachungs file. He was protected by Erich Kord himself, and also had an interview. I didn't mention her oral history. I could find the last old Freifrau, the old Baronin who knew him. And she told me, yes, we knew that, when the situation was becoming a bit difficult, he could go on hiding in the castle. Because don't forget that it was in the aristocratic circles, and those families, they had many hiding places. So he was going to Silesia or to find a shelter, and then coming back to Berlin. Yes, but I really try to remain focused and not, write, 20 pages on Mischlinger in general. I hope the reader will appreciate the originality of this.
Well, it seems to me one of the things that it makes possible is that you kind of throw categories to the wind a little bit, even at the very beginning saying, was he perhaps even a perpetrator? Once you've stepped away from, I'm going to look at the whole category of X, then you allow yourself to think differently. Where do you come down there? Should we think of this man as a victim, a perpetrator?
Yeah, I didn't fit into any of those categories. And, I was struck by the fact that he was double and he had to go through denazification. It was not easy. It was not an easy process. It took him some weeks and he had to bring witnesses, certificate, etc. And he also could claim compensation. So he was both, He was in both stream of German history.
Okay, we've gotten some questions now, so we can rely on our audience a little. Oh, good. Okay. One of our audience members is asking for context. Some of that context that you refused yourself, but we know you did the research. How many mixed marriages were there in Germany? And what were their survival percentages? So let's understand him more in the broader context.
So did not find a set number of Mischlinger. The German statistics themselves constantly diverge immensely, from a few dozens of thousands to 1.5 million, including the Mischlinger of second degree, which means that the people who had only one Jewish grandparent. So even for this, we're not very sure in the number of them. What we know is that they were persecuted. They could not go to university, to education. They were the limitation in the professions was extreme. But at the end, that they were not killed. Mm-hmm. But they were deported or submitted to forced labor in, not all of them, in some region and in some labor camps that were not concentration camps. For this, there is an important article written by Martin Dean about 2 of those camps. And also the conditions in the camps was... So what we can see, to make a long story short, is that there was not a unique decision made centrally by the cabinet, by Lösner, who was in charge of the status of Jews in the Ministry of Interior, that the situation varied locally enormously and varied according to the person. Locally, for example, we know that the Mischlinger and the Jews in mixed marriage from the western part of Germany were expelled to the center, which exactly fit into what happened to Hermine Rosenfeld and Eleonore von Maltzan. So we know now that they were not killed, that they survived, but that was not known. I mean, the fate, they were living in a situation of uncertainty. They didn't know what to expect.
Right. Okay, here's a couple questions about the post-war. How is Vollrath remembered within the von Maltzan family afterwards?
So I could find only 3 people who knew him. On the 6 cousins you've seen, only one had child, one daughter. And what I could get from oral history is that people knew his history, that he was Jewish or half Jewish, that he went through difficult hardship in the war, but it was absolutely not said and official in the family. So there was a huge silence about his fate in the family. But he was also, in post-war, in the 1950s, the member of the Maltzan who made it, was the most successful. Some other member became successful in the 60s, 70s, and after the Wende, as businessman, etc. But in the 50s, he was the big man in the family. But this silence is very interesting.
And is that silence just in the family? That relates to this other question. How did West Germany use this victim of the Third Reich to establish its credentials as a democratic country?
So that's an interesting chapter of my book. I think it's interesting, is that in a very brief period of time, 48, 52, 53, 54 maybe, in the re-establishment of the German diplomacy, there were a lot of people who were like Vollrath von Maltzan. I give you one example among many. Ausenstein was not the first ambassador. He was the predecessor of Maltzan in Paris, but he was a Gesander. He was just the envoy. He didn't have the title. He was an art historian. He was a specialist of French art, and he was sent in 1951 to Paris to re-establish the relation. Ausenstein had a Jewish wife, Margot Kohn. And Margot Kohn survived in Germany because she was in intermarriage and he refused to divorce. Think of what's his name? Haas, who was a Jewish wife. A lot of people were, who had trouble during the Third Reich without being deported, killed, etc. And there were those people who were used in these brief years to re-establish the credential of, for example, the ambassador to London that was appointed in 1955, von Herwarth, had a Jewish grandmother. And he played this card, arriving to London, repeating all the time, I had a Jewish grandmother, my family. So invited the father of Anne Frank at the embassy. He played in the early 50s, So you had and then immediately it stopped, and you had not the old Nazi, but the people who had a continuous, non-problematic career in the Third Reich who came back. And I was interested, so the predecessor of Maltzan, but also of the man, Kleiber, who was appointed after him in 1958. And Kleiber was a Nazi diplomat. He was posted in Turkey. He was posted in Serbia just at the end of the killing of the Jews. So it was a brief moment where those, again, quotation mark, half victims were used to see the good, to show the good Germany, and then it stopped.
Here's an interesting one. So did von Maltzan's restitution claims include his loss of his Jewish mother and her assets?
Yes, so you have a lot of files, and they were the most useful material I could find on Hermine Rosenfeld, and the claim for the furniture, the property, but he didn't get a lot. In the process of the loss of chance in the career, which is one of the article in the Begg law, there was no loss of chance because he was pushed to the top. He made a very quick re-establishment of his career when he was appointed in 1949, one of the top directors of the Ministry of Economy. But he tried. This is also a milieu of this aristocrat, German aristocrat from the East, don't forget, that were, and that's also something I describe in Wiesbaden, all the cousins, Maltzan, the brother-in-law, etc., they were extremely impoverished. And they were people who were landowners, big or small, in the East. Of course, they have been dispossessed by the communist regime in Poland, the change of border, or in Mecklenburg, and they had no profession. So the description you made in Wiesbaden, in Munich, of these in the late 40s and 50s is that they were very, very, very poor. They were living from the little money of compensation given by the German state. The next generation reestablished itself very nicely, and we know that the surprise that they became good Democrats within the Republic, that those people were considered as the foremost nationalists, the traditionalist Germans, they became good West German citizens.
So in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask one last great question, which is about today. Today in Germany, many young adults proudly call themselves Mischlinge. What do you think of this?
Yeah, it's
reclaiming this category.
Reclaiming this category that was a very, for a long time, sided, put aside. So something also I discovered, with discussion with my colleagues working on Mischlinge is I thought that the career of Maltzan was representative, that many of these Mischlinge were made interesting, important career after the war, or the people in mixed marriage, who had a Jewish wife. And in fact, we know that it's not true, that Maltzan was, in this sense, also an exception, that many of the Mischlinge emigrated after the war. They could not find, or the people in mixed marriage could not find their place back into the normal German society.
Certainly a category worth our thinking about a lot more, as you've shown tonight. I want to thank you for your wonderful lecture and invite all of you upstairs for the reception. Thank you.
Thank you very much.